All right, Dr. Snoke.
Yeah. So yeah, this is going to be a follow-up to the talk that I did last time, but I'm actually going to move on to some very different things and not talk about thermodynamics too much. But as we were chatting before this meeting, I thought this would be a good follow-up to talk about engineering principles and so on. So I'm titling this Systems Biology as a Research Paradigm for Intelligent Design. And this is kind of a teaser because oftentimes people will think of intelligent design primarily as an apologetics program to sort of not imply any new science as such, but to really just be an evidential argument for the existence of God. But actually, what we're finding, and I'll talk about this, is that it's actually turning out to be a very good research paradigm. So let me, let me see here, I have to go here. Okay, so let me remind you of sort of stuff that I ended up with in the last talk. So over the last couple centuries, really coming out of the Enlightenment, going all the way back to Laplace, people who sort of took Newton's laws and ran with them. Newton himself was not a reductionist, but his laws were taken by many others very shortly after his life to give a mechanistic reductionist view of the world. And so we could call this the atheist creation myth, that you had a machine-like universe and that everything we know, life and everything, can be understood just simple actions of of atoms and molecules bouncing off each other and so on. As a result of that premise, then science in particular in the area of biology has taken what can be called a bottom-up approach, which is to say that in principle at least, everything important can be determined by just starting with the microscopic atoms and then deriving from that the behavior of larger things and getting larger and larger until you get to all kinds of living systems. And I'm not going to take a poll here, but I would bet that lots of people, when they took physics, heard something along the lines of have the basic laws of nature and the elements and the parameters, the theory of everything, and we can describe everything adequately. There's nothing more. In principle, everything can be derivable from that. Turns out, success is not really true. You have said you could given somebody, and they would never have out of it. There's certain things that you only see at a larger scale that you simply wouldn't guess from the microscopic approach. But at least in principle, there has been this approach, especially in biology, that if we just start from the microscopic stuff and build up from there, we'll get to everything that we need to know. And even in some of the biological literature, that's called the physics approach. That, that's sort of the way physicists tend to think, I guess you could say.
Oh, he died. We'll wait until he reconnects.
Sorry about that. I don't know if that's probably on my end here.
Yeah.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay. I'm going to sit here on what I call 5 decades of biophysics failure, really starting with that bottom-up reductionist paradigm. And one way to think about this is sort of, what do physicists naturally do, when we study something? Well, one of the things you can do is take things apart and look at them piece by piece. System, looking at single molecules, disassembling the cell, and so you're not really looking at the real thing anymore. On the other hand, something that we do all the time in physics is we can make toy models and average the behavior. So for instance, we can talk about solids in terms of just elastic constants and things like that without looking at the details, and we've averaged properties. But the problem is biology doesn't really work that way either, because there's many processes that are crossing different levels of scale. And so you can't just talk about average. I mentioned this the last time. One of the things there was great hope put into that, and really for several decades, people were really viewing this as the paradigm for the origin of life. And the idea is creating a very simple, what we call a toy model, show sort of one effect, and then generalize that and say, well, this would be how it all works. Well, as I talked about last time, actually, that's a miserable failure, and I've really rarely seen in physics, models be abandoned as much as this one has, in terms of trying to explain the origin of life. So I talked last time a little bit about essentially all of these spontaneous pattern formation experiments that have been, pointed at. Spontaneous appearance of so if you make the parameters of your system the right way. Can you see my cursor, by the way?
No.
If you make the parameters just the right temperature and pressure, you form a natural length scale for convection cells, and then you get this, kind of convection cell thing. So can you see my mouse?
Yes.
Moving it around there.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, good. Similarly, on sand dunes, the wind speed and so on, and the friction of the sand create another natural length scale. And so in some sense, it looks like magic, right? We've got a appearance of order. As I talked about last time, it has nothing whatsoever to do with an open system or closed system. It really just has to do with the natural length scale appearing in the system. And then when that happens, there's always going to be an instability that causes that natural length scale to arise. The problem is that's just one length scale that's appeared in the system. Real living systems have many, many different length scales, a hierarchy of all kinds of different levels, from single atoms to cells to organs to populations, organisms. There's hierarchy of many, many different length scales, and they all feed information up and down from one level to the other. And so you just can't, really, it's actually hard to even get two spontaneous length scales to appear in a system, much less hundreds or thousands. And as I said, these toy models really, if you have multiple length scales, you end up just getting one. Where you have, instead of a absolute natural length scale, you get a ratio of two length scales, or a ratio of lengths that becomes a natural number, and that leads to fractal behavior and so on. But again, there's still just one number in the system, which is this ratio. That was up until the 90s, say, maybe even early 2000s. What has happened in the last 20 years is that biophysics, generally defined, has completely given up on that and turned to something completely different, which is a top-down approach, an explicitly top-down approach, which is sometimes called an engineering approach, although I don't think it's in violation of how physicists think. So I'm going to summarize two papers. This is one of them, which is a review article I wrote several years ago now. I think that's 2014 already. Wow. In general, there's a new field. It's maybe in its infancy, 40 or so years, but it really received new energy just in the last 20 years. And it's called systems biology. And that's a deliberate borrowing of term from systems engineering. So essentially what they're doing is they're going to systems engineering departments that look at systems of interplay between different parts of a system. And there's been quite a bit of engineering of systems that leads to whole departments of systems engineering and journals of system engineering and so on. And they have consciously adapted and adopted engineering principles into biology. And now physicists like Bill Bialik in my field have really run with this. And it's an explicit top-down approach. So you're saying we're going to actually identify design principles and then say, well, okay, now that we have the top level of what we want to happen, how do we implement that? And we ask, well, one level down, what kind of parts are we going to need to accomplish that task? And then you go down and say, okay, I've got my subtasks. What do I need in order to accomplish those subtasks? And you keep working your way down the system. And this has become amazingly productive as a research paradigm. So I'm going to walk you through a little bit of this here. So it's an explicit rejection of the bottom-up emergence approach, and it's a full embrace of top-down thinking. And I have just a sort of a bit of a survey absolutely explicit in this field. Talking about, you can see here, explicitly using terms like identifying goals and objectives or functions. And rather than focusing on individual parts, looking at the big picture and identifying goals and objectives. Now, this makes a lot of biologists, or has made a lot of biologists, uncomfortable because in philosophical terms, it is explicitly embracing what's called teleology, which is the idea of final causes, what Aristotle called final causes. Just to illustrate the difference, and I might have talked about this last time, if you think about the cause of something, and this goes straight back to Aristotle, there's sort of two answers. Somebody says, why did this happen? What caused it? There might be two answers to that. So if I say I went to the grocery store, you might say, well, what was the cause of that? And one answer might be, well, I stepped on the gas pedal of my car, which caused gasoline to explode in the engine, which made the wheels rotate, which then made the car roll toward the grocery store. That would be a causal explanation in terms of a past history. On the other hand, to answer that question by saying, I went to the store because I wanted to get bread, or I wanted to get butter. And that would be a purpose or an aim. And essentially, the reductionist approach for the last 200 years, starting with the Enlightenment, has absolutely rejected the idea of teleological explanations as valid. The idea of saying, what's it for, what's it good for, has been outright rejected as a causal explanation. And you can see in my quote here, this is a very well-known scientist writing a review article or an opinion column, I guess I should say, in a well-known journal, who's saying, we need to embrace teleology. We need to embrace talking about purpose of things. And that even to this day still makes some people uncomfortable, but it is literally the foundational principle for this whole field of systems biology. So again, just summarizing here. And I'm just throw a lot of quotes out because this is not me just kind of picking and choosing. This is really all through the literature here. You can see in some cases, here's a paper talking about the coherent design in which they're going to identify the design principles in terms of optimized tolerances and trade-offs, which is pure and systems and but they feel incumbent to put on a parenthesis with no implication that there's an actual designer in their paper, just so people wouldn't be confused. So how does abundantly clear to people? Um, uh, can you still hear me?
Yes,
It's
it's
okay.
cutting a little bit.
Um,
I'm not sure why, but yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, every now and then I get like a pop-up that says my internet is unstable. But so far so good. Okay, so here, I actually put this in a paper, wow, almost 20 years ago. Suppose that someone gave you a computer chip and you were told to figure out how it works. Now there's two different narratives about the computer chip that you were told. One possibility is they're told, well, this was generated by a completely random process of many committees working cross purposes to each other, communicating badly with each other, and randomly overwriting stuff that other committees were doing, and generally just randomly sticking stuff in. And when they finally found one that worked, they just ran with it. That's story number one. Story number two is you're told, here is a circuit. It was designed by a master engineer who is nearly perfect in engineering ability. Now, can you imagine that that would lead to different ways of approaching your study of this chip? In the case of the first one, you would expect to find a lot of junk. You'd expect to find a lot of things that were suboptimal. If there was something you didn't understand, you might say it's not worth studying because it's probably just junk. On the other hand, in the second case, you'd be saying, well, okay, if there's something I don't understand, it might be because it's actually above me or beyond me, and I need to work harder to understand it because I believe it's actually serving a purpose. And so it does lead to differences in your science. Now, in biology, we have circuits like this, and very similar things apply. Do you say, well, I expect a lot of junk, or do I expect that really this is a master design and it's a well-engineered system and I should treat it as such? It turns out that even though people don't like the term design, and they put in parentheses with no implication of designer, it turns out that thinking like an engineer, studying or reverse engineering a system designed by a master engineer is incredibly productive and has led to really good advances in biology. I'm just going to run through, again, just more literature here. Here you have another review paper talking about the rise of use of information, top-down causation, that's again explicitly teleology. And you can see they're talking about causal structure, information flow. These are all engineering words. Another one, top-down models, control systems, and so on. And I don't have time to really read through all these. Design principles gets used in multiple papers. And again, in each case, they're basically saying, let me assume that this is a well-designed system, that every little thing is playing an important purpose, and then let me kind of back out from that, and then what that implies for a good engineered system. Here's another one, engineering models for systems biology. We identify the cell as an embedded computing system, demonstrate that systems biology shares many aspects in common with systems, electrochemical engineering, and so on. None of these people, as far as I know, are hearing, but they're simply saying that it really well to assume that this is a design system. And then this is a textbook. Once a field is matured to a certain point, the textbooks start to get written. And you see, now this is a textbook which in multiple places talks about the engineering principles in play. And here you can see that what they call the biology approach is up things, but the engineering is the top down. And they're saying that actually biology often shows more remarkable design from the top down than much of our present technology. In other words, we learn technology from looking at biological systems. It's often doing better than things we can do. Just as simple, probably some of you know that photosynthesis converts the solar energy to usable free energy in the cell with almost 100% efficiency. I mean, like 99.999% efficiency. And the best solar cells we can do are maybe have gotten to 30%. So there's a huge mismatch, and biology is just doing far better than us. The spin motion we're far that
You're cutting down quite a bit now.
more quotes. Is there a question? Or is that just somebody not muted?
No,
okay.
I think
That's just another quote from that.
Dropped.
Sorry about that. I'm actually sitting in Brazil at the moment.
You're in Brazil.
It's been pretty good with the internet.
Yeah.
Yeah, the internet's been pretty good, but it's getting a little iffy right now. Okay, so here's from that same book, talking about how E. coli using a feedback system, to give it robustness to fluctuates in the environment, and it's following engineering principles. And here, this is a table, a lengthy table from that same book showing all of the different computing architecture systems that have analogies in living systems. And you can go all the way down, gates, flip-flops, oscillators at the lowest level, data paths, instructions, data memory, memory addressing, high-level formatting, cache memory. Every one of these has a biological analogy that they found. Operating systems, timing patterns, hierarchy where information is passed up and down, and so on and so forth. And just as an example, this is the simplest known living cell. It has 8 essential genes, and high designed and like that in systems biology and circuit things. Now, why does this lead to quantitative predictions? It's not just saying, oh, let me kind of think that way, but it's equations and approaches. And I just listed a few of them here. One of the main ones is the idea of optimization. So if you assume something is well designed, you're going to assume that there are trade-offs between different parameters, and that if you can identify the goals, and then I can do a optimization, which is where you can do, which optimizes the best solution among all the different parameters given a certain in mathematical terms, that means that when optimal point, the slope is 0. And so that's a mathematical prediction. You can say you've defined a figure of merit, and you say you're at a maximum of that figure of merit, and that says then that the slope is equal to 0. That allows you to write down a mathematical equation. There's numerous other things. Feedback, whether positive for switch type behavior or negative feedback for control behavior, involves circuitry. Timing, you need some kind of clock. You need an oscillation frequency, which involves resonances. And you can find those resonances and define Q factors for them. I'm throwing a lot of mathematical jargon. If you don't follow, don't worry about it. Triggering involves thresholding behavior. You're going to have a moving threshold. So if you think about with your eye, if you walk into a dark room, the threshold for your eye changes and the amplification jumps up. And if you walk into a bright room or outside, your amplification factor is set down. So there's feedback for the thresholds. And also one that's quite interesting, I just saw a talk by Bill Bialik just a few weeks ago. This is really fascinating, but in general, whenever there is meaningful language, this is something that linguists have studied, and also code breakers, the pattern of symbols follows very well-defined power laws. So for example, if you're a code breaker and you have just a bunch of characters and you want to know whether there's a message there or not, one of the most important things for a code breaker to know is whether they've got a message to decode at all. Typically, if someone's trying to not have their code be broken, they're going to put out a lot of random nonsense to try to confuse other people. Two-letter sequences have a certain frequency, and three-letter frequencies, and so on. And so you can characterize the frequency of things that are meaningful language. And it is not white noise. There's a definite power law to it. And so you can identify meaningful information by these kinds of tests, even when you don't know what the information is saying. Just a whole lot of stuff. Some of it's reviewed in the paper that I mentioned there. So where do we go with this? There's two sides to this. I'm going to just say a little bit about this, and then I'll go into the last part of my talk. What I would argue is that what you see in all these papers is basically sort of a nod in one sentence to Darwinism or natural selection as the cause of all these things, but no actual drawing on any of that for any of the useful design principles. So they'll approach it entirely like someone who believes in God as a designer, and then they'll just give a toss-off. But of course, evolution has done it. There's no discussion about how evolution did it or anything like that. It's just a nod or a toss-off. There's actually a kind of fascinating story. Just a few years ago, some of you may have seen this in the papers. There was a Chinese group that was doing some systems biology, and used the word the designer has said, the designer has designed such and such. And there's a great outcry of people saying, how did this intelligent design paper get published? This is terrible. And the authors issued clarifying statements saying, we apologize. When we kept hearing people using the word design, we assumed that talking about the designer was okay, but actually we'll back off from that. We'll just talk about design with no designer. But of course, design involves teleology, which involves purpose, and purpose involves a purposer of some sort or other. So anyway, there basically is saying that all these design elements that they're identifying, they're really treating as a useful fiction. They're saying there really was no design. There really was no purpose. It just turns out to be extremely convenient to act as though there was. Really we'll just pretend to pretend that it was designed, and then from that we'll extract all these useful principles. And you think about that, what does that say? That the way to do the best biology is that you actually have to pretend or act like the system was well designed by a master designer, even if you don't believe that it really was. the problem is that, this kind of useful fiction approach has a long history of things that people imagined to be the case or posited turning out to really be there. So I just listed a few here. There was people in the 1800s who said, well, I know that the atomic all really good predictions for thermodynamics, but I don't believe in atoms. I think they're just a useful fiction. That was actually Ernst Mach. Other people saying, well, fields aren't really real. That's just a useful fiction. And these things have a way of becoming realities in science over time. And so the idea of saying, well, we'll pretend there's, but really there isn't, is I call it philosophically bankrupt. It's trying to pretend that it's trying to call something a fiction when actually it works really well to describe data. But the thing I want to spend the rest of the time on is actually to question the basic premise that goes into these sort of nods, which is the general approach is to say, well, natural selection has a way of improving efficiency of things, because if it's inefficient, it's more likely to die off. And so doesn't it stand to reason that if I have some, randomly fluctuating environment and natural selection, that beasts with, inefficient things will get killed off, and so over time, optimality will increase. Now, there's never actually a model shown for how that works. That's sort of the intuition that people have. Just right off the bat, I would say it's not at all clear that that should be the case, because we're talking about solving optimization problems. And many optimization problems are, in mathematical terms, called NP-hard. That is that their solution scales exponentially with time. And saying that nature has in multiple cases solved NP-hard problems by random trial and error is really quite a statement. And I'm not going to go into a lot of computational mathematical stuff, but even 4 billion years is not long if you're trying to solve an NP-hard optimization problem, which I would argue many biological systems have been shown to do. But I want to go a little further and actually present another publication that I did. And this one's also from 2014. So this is actually a mathematical model. And I'll present this. How much time do I have left here? I don't have a clock handy here. Oh, I got plenty of time here, I think. And so this is basically saying, let's put some meat on this and actually ask how easily can biological systems get rid of inefficient things or junk? And the intuition that people have is that, this should be an easy thing to do. So here's the model. It's simplified very much, but actually it's interesting. I put this out there, it sat there for several years. And then just this past year, I was talking to a couple biologists who got really interested in this model. And so we put in a proposal to NIH to run this model in more realistic ways. And so maybe in a couple of years, we'll have some more realistic things. But this model, I think, delineates a lot of the problems. Suppose in general, we have some parameter space. Here I've just got 2 parameters, but this could be a multi-dimensional space. Typical protein might have 10 to 20 different relevant design parameters in terms of lengths of armatures and so on. And we're going to say that we're going to do random walks in parameter space where we sort of add and subtract different things. And there's going to be a cost and a reward. Okay, so the more tries that you make, the more random changes you make, the longer this path gets, there's going to be an energy cost to that. And that corresponds to the energy cost of making things that aren't doing anything. So if I grew a third leg, and that third leg isn't helping me walk, that's a net drain on my system. It may not kill me, but it has an energy cost to making it. On the other hand, in this parameter space, we can say there are certain areas where if you get to that set of parameters, then you get some big reward. Maybe you have a new motor, or you have some bendable arm or something like that. So you can parameterize this problem by two numbers: the benefit of hitting one of these targets, their density in parameter space is another one actually, and then compare that reward to the cost of building random stuff. And so this basically, the premise of the model is, if we're going to have our Darwinian system, we have to allow for some random stabs in the dark of making things that don't do anything, at least at first. And the idea is you make a bunch of things, and maybe you carry them for a while. They're not doing anything, but they don't cost too much to make, so they don't kill you. You carry them around for a while, and then eventually 3 or 4 of them fit together and they make a widget that actually does something good for you. And now there's a big benefit, and you out-survive all of your neighbors, and you replace it. And so there's a trade-off here. There's the energy cost of building new things. And I'm being very vague about what's being built, because this argument works at any level. We could be talking about new types of cells, could be talking about new genes. So there's many hierarchy levels that this could work at. And so there's a trade-off of cost of building random new stuff. And there's the reward of getting new things. Now, here's the basic trade-off that we have. If you make the cost of building new stuff too high, you never get anything new, because those creatures that make that are so inefficient, they just get killed off. On the other hand, you could say, well, if I make that cost low, then it makes it very likely that I'll hit new things. I'll build a lot of new stuff. But it also means it's very hard to get rid of useless junk because its cost is low. And so there's very little survival impact to having useless stuff. And so it's called weakly deleterious for the biologists. And so there's been actually a lot of people studying the problem of weakly deleterious mutations, which means that they're slightly negative, but that means that it's hard to get rid of them by natural selection, and they end up being fixed in the whole population. Everybody gets these eventually. And so, as I said, you can try this with different approaches, different densities of the targets, and there's a lot of parameters you can vary. But the results that we got are actually very robust. And I'll just, again, many different variations of this. You could have duplications, you could have random removal of things, you could have population bottlenecks, all kinds of things you can try. The results are generally not changed from basically what I'm showing here. If you take time in generations, and on this plot here, what we have is the fraction of useless stuff that's generated. And indeed, initially, that fraction of useless stuff drops very rapidly at first, that organisms with useless stuff get killed off. But suddenly there's a turnaround. And why is there a turnaround? Well, at some point, they start hitting these functional goals. And the value of the new function far outweighs the cost of carrying the junk. And at that point, you start to be able to carry junk because the benefit of hitting these targets has been so great. Score or figure of merit, whatever you want to call them. What you see is indeed the competition between them leads to an increase of fitness, very rapid, and these are different parameters that have been varied for the score for
We're losing you again.
But it's after there's a population collapse. And the reason for that collapse is because they've accumulated so much junk. You can see here, they reach nearly 100% vestigiality, 100%, 99.9% of them are stuck full of useless, non-functioning stuff. And that actually is better for any individual than to have not hit any of these functional targets and be very efficient. And so this generally points out an intrinsic problem. If you say that we want natural selection to kill off inefficient things, it's very hard to get novelty. But the record of history that we see is that there is novelty popping up in the history of life on a regular basis. On the other hand, if you say we're going to make novelty easy, then it becomes very hard to get rid of junk that's not doing anything. And so that actually has been the intuition. But 100 years ago, biologists would have said that life is probably full of useless stuff. And that flies in the face of the assumptions of the systems biology world, which is saying actually it's hardly anything useless. There's a few things that are broken down, but mostly everything is highly optimized and efficient. Okay, so in general, if you make the cost of building new stuff too high, you never get novelty. If you make the cost too low, then you get useless stuff, which I call vestigial stuff, filling up. And so actually the question here is not why is there any junk DNA, for example, but why is that not 99.999% junk DNA, which a model like this would predict? So let me just finish up with this then. The biology world has embraced a premise of intelligent design. They just don't like the word intelligent on it. They would say somehow we've gotten super good design that beats anything that human engineers can come up with. They give a nod to somehow evolution did it. But actually, when you try to put numbers on that, as I did in this numerical model, you find that it just is really hard. There may be a way that I haven't figured out. And like I said, I'm working with some biologists and computer science people who we're going to try to run some and be interested to see how it comes out. But if it does come out, it's almost certainly going to be a fine-tuned system to allow novelty to appear. So I'll finish with that. I think that's my last slide. Yep. And I'd be happy to take questions. Thanks.
Well, we had a little bit of gaps with the sound, but I think we got the gist of it, most of the idea, no? So well, thank you. I didn't know you were in Brazil.
Yeah, it's a conference I'm at, and it's nice because it's warm. But yeah, there's some technology breakdowns here.
That's all right. Okay, well, open the floor to questions.
Yeah, you can. If you didn't hear something, feel free to ask me, what did you say with that one slide?
Go on over, Anderson.
I have a question. Is there any kind of metric or inventory that's been taken of systems engineering systems in biology being optimal or being not optimal? In other words, is there any objective criteria that you can use from the engineering world to look at a biological system and say, okay, yes, this system is optimal for the task, or it's not optimal for the task? Has anybody done any kind of inventory or metric of that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. First of all, we still don't know the full extent of how living systems work. I mean, typically what people are looking at is like one subsystem and figuring out how that works. And things like triggered release of certain circuits to only turn on in certain circumstances is, there's still a whole lot of stuff we don't know. For instance, like the vitamin C gene is turned on for embryos and then it's turned off for the rest of our lives. There's all kinds of crazy stuff like that. So to answer your question, I would say no one has done really quantitatively an inventory like that. But I would say that the premise of the whole systems biology community is that everything they look at, they start with the assumption it is nearly perfectly optimal. And that anytime someone assumes less than optimality, they usually get the wrong answer. So that's not to say there's none to be found. It's also not to say there's no broken systems, but actually finding things that are broken often points to how delicate the mechanism really is and how finely tuned it is. Things don't work and break down. But that would be a really good project. I think it's partly hampered by the fact there's very few people who know everything that's going on, even of what we know. And there's a lot that is known we don't know.
Yeah, it just seems to me that what you just said, that there's this expectation that the system in biology is going to be in some optimal state. That's an expectation of observation. But if you believed Darwinism, you shouldn't expect that. You should expect them all to be in a terrible shambles kind of a state, with maybe one or two of them doing something right. But you would expect it to all just be this terrible mess.
Yes,
But it's like what you say, everybody.
well,
This
so
yeah, it's gonna be.
because if you were 50 or 100 years, can you hear me?
No, okay, let's start again, please. Yeah.
Do you think the bandwidth would help
I'm not.
turn off their video feed?
I think the
Is
problem
someone
is,
talking?
I know, but maybe his feed is affected by the video.
so we stop the video from people and see what happens. Okay, let's try that. Does
Can you hear me?
everyone stop the video and see if that improves the bandwidth? Hey, Dr. Snoke, are you still there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, all right, let's see, let's try that.
Yeah, sorry about that. So to go back to the last thing I heard, it is certainly historically the case that biologists did expect to find lots of junk. That's not debatable. I mean, that was the expectation. And it led to numerous things. It led to people simply saying certain things aren't worth studying. It also led medically to people removing organs that they felt were vestigial, like the appendix, must just be doing nothing. And such. Now, more recently, people have said, oh, no, of course, Darwinism leads to optimality through this mechanism that I told you about killing off. They did expect what they find living systems full of junk.
Yeah, we
Are you
lost
there?
you. We lost you, yeah.
Where did you lose me?
We can hold off on turning off your videos and see if that decreases the bandwidth, see if we can get a better reception from Dr.
I
Snow.
can try turning off mine.
Can everybody turn
Yeah.
off theirs?
Yeah, actually, I can stop sharing at this point too.
All right,
Um,
let's see what happens.
We'll see. All right, how
All right.
much did you hear? I was talking about the historical predictions of biology.
We didn't get much, so you want to start again? Sorry.
All right, I'll try. Third time's the charm. So the question was, do biologists, would they predict from a Darwinist approach that living systems are full of junk? And I would say historically, the answer is clearly yes, that 50 or 100 years ago, there was a strong expectation that living systems should be full of junk. And you have things like the book, The Panda's Thumb, and others sort of using that as an argument for evolution, saying, look at all the inefficiency, look at all the badly designed things. Junk DNA and the appendix as a vestigial organ, and so on. And that is now not the case. They have changed their tune and they're saying, no, we expect it to be optimal, for the reason gave, because evolution kills off inefficiency, and therefore we're totally fine with everything being optimal. But that's not what they originally said. Working from their assumptions, they predicted, and you still find some people out there using like panda's thumb type arguments, arguing for inefficiency when actually they're just way behind the times. Did you get that?
Yes.
Yeah. Very clear, actually.
I had kind of a question and observation.
Sure.
So kind of a shout out to all the engineers out there who have ever had to tune a feedback loop. You know, a feedback loop is basic control system where you've got a set point and a sensor, and you're trying to drive some process by measuring it to go to some value, you know, like a temperature controller. You want the room temperature to be 72 degrees, and you've got a heater and a cooler and a sensor. And so you're using feedback, turning the heater and the cooler on and off to get this temperature. Well, to everybody who's ever tried to tune one of these stupid feedback loops, okay, there's several, even if it's just controlled by one number, which is the gain, right? Having a feedback loop that is optimally tuned just doesn't happen. And you have to sit there and mess with it and mess with it and mess with it and tweak it to try to get it tuned right. And so my question, Dr. Snoke, is there, I know there's, you mentioned a couple of these feedback loops in biological systems. And I wonder, would it be possible to simply go into a handful of these feedback loops, PID loops, and identify whether or not the gains are tuned such that you get something like optimal PID loop control for that PID loop. And then you could say, well, okay, how likely is it in the parameter space that you would happen to pick the correct gain for the feedback loop? And how long would it take you to pick the correct gain for the feedback loop if there was some, you know, random walk trying to pick the correct gain?
Yeah, well, so the answer is that is one that is well studied in systems biology, and it's known to be the case all over the place, that there are many hundreds of finely tuned feedback loops in a single cell. And that's just the ones we discovered. And they're all highly tuned. And not only that, you have variable gain systems for the feedback. So I mentioned this, you know, the human eye can see almost single photons. We're not quite the single photon level, but nearly single photon detection, all the way up to being able to look at time without burning our eyes out. And so you're talking about an amplifier which has a variable amplification over something like 20 orders of magnitude. And that's a toughie, you know, to do engineering wise. And that's just one example of many in biology.
Yeah, so it seems like this might be a way, if you take the simple feedback loops and their gains, and then say, you know, how probable is that gain out of the complete space of gains, that gain setting that could have been, to try to get some sense of how long it would take a random process to tune the PID loop.
Yeah, so what you're talking about basically would be an apologetic argument to say, given the stuff that we see, like how likely is it to happen by random processes? That's generally not the question that they're asking. The question they're asking is, how can we actually understand how this actually works? And so they will simply say, let's assume that it's amazingly well designed and super, super efficient. And now, if I think like a master engineer, how would I do it? And then I look and I say, okay, there must be a detector. Where's the detector? And you go look for it. And you say, well, there must be a thresholding system. Where's that? You know, and you look for it and you find it, right? And you basically say, like, I know how feedback works, and therefore I'm going to look for all those parts, and I'm going to assume they're doing as good as physically is allowed. You know, I'll just give you one example of optimality. This is from Bill Bialik, who again, to my knowledge, is not a Christian at all. But he argues that living systems are fine-tuned optimally to the best that is physically possible. And the example he uses is that of bat hearing. You know, the bats that fly in the night air. They use sonar to detect mosquitoes from, you know, hundreds of meters away. And somebody did a very clever experiment in which they asked, well, what is the time resolution of the sonar emitted by bats? Like, how good is the pulse phase analysis that the bat is doing? And it turns out it's about a nanosecond. And you can show that you literally cannot do better physically than that, given the fluctuations of the molecules in the air. So bat sonar is as good a sonar system as it is physically possible to make at that frequency.
So what I'm going to encapsulate this for me. You're kind of saying in a big picture for me that using a systems biology approach where you assume a highly optimized or are very well optimized, that the systems are well optimized, yields more experimental and scientific positive results than if you assume the opposite, which is you assume that it was largely evolutionary junk with vestigial problems and everything. So that reductionist approach and that assumption that there's a lot of junk in there doesn't yield as much useful information as if you assume a highly optimized design system. Is that
right? Yeah, and that's not just my opinion. That is the consensus of thousands of PhD scientists in the field. It's no longer even slightly controversial. But it's interesting, I would say, in terms of how we think about this, you know, reasons to believe is very interested in apologetics, obviously. But there's another way to go with this, which is to simply say, if we live in a created world, how should we interact with that created world based on the assumption that it's created, right? And so it actually, totally apart from apologetics, we ought to be good scientists because we say we expect good design, and that actually leads us to doing good science because we are looking. And so actually, I think there's a place for Christians to enter in here because I think we're actually even more willing to see design than many other people are willing to see, even though they're sort of being pressed into it by the observations. It still is the case that they're constantly surprised at how optimal things are, you know, and you know, we should be willing to go there, you know, and say, you know, maybe not just each thing, but like the whole system's optimized and so on and so forth.
Very good.
I will mention, I mentioned at the beginning, if people are interested, there's an engineering research group of Christians trying to apply engineering principles to biological systems. Some of it is apologetics, but some of it is also just sort of saying, like, how can we do good engineering in the biology world?
What are the barriers in the implementation? I'm thinking here about your example of the photosynthesis in our solar cells. What are the barriers that are preventing us from going from what we have right now in solar cells into a system that is as efficient as photosynthesis?
Well, if we knew exactly, then we would be able to solve the problem. Right?
Ignorance, essentially, we don't know enough.
well, it's all the motors associated with the photosynthetic process.
So in
Regeneration of the
So in a very general hand-waving kind of way, when people look at these extremely efficient motors or extremely efficient photocells, what they find is that the dissipation is extremely, extremely low. And that is because there is enormous fine tuning of the different parts to resonate at exactly the same frequency. And so you'll have parts of molecules that mesh exactly with other molecules that are built in completely different parts of the cell based on different genes, and yet they perfectly match each other. So it again comes down to fine tuning again, that when we try to mass produce solar cells, it's a lot harder to do them. And also, I think there's also certain things that are possible in organic systems that are not really possible with semiconductors. The problem is when we work with organic systems, we always end up with a bunch of junk and tar. And it's very hard to have pristine, perfect organic systems.
You'd have to build all of these three-dimensional proteins in some sort of mass production way and have them all come together in some really nice mass production way.
Right.
Right.
And then if you do that, you can teach them how to build their own mass production sites, right? And so then yeah. Yeah, I remember, so this is a story. I don't know if the sound will let me tell the story, but it's a fictional story of someone who says, I've created a flying robot. And the person says, well, that's very impressive amount of engineering. And it says, well, you haven't heard the whole story yet. It's only, 100 microns across and it still flies. Wow, that's really quite amazing. Well, not only that, but it's powered by finding things in the environment that it uptakes. And so you never need to recharge it. It just flies continuously by taking things from mind. Wow, that's really impressive. Well, not only that, but if the environment changes, it will make a copy of itself with a slightly different variation that might be more suited to the environment. Oh, that's an easy problem. That's just evolution then. I mean, if you think about it, like actually adaptation is an even higher level of design, to be able to have a machine that makes a copy of itself with variations is a no mean feat, which no engineer has yet succeeded in doing, as far as I know.
So you're saying the survival of the fittest is straightforward to understand. The arrival of the fittest is much more difficult.
Well, that, yeah, or even the system to let things change, but not just build a highly designed system. So you may not be aware, like bacterial immunity has almost nothing to do with in evolution. Bacterial immunity is very similar to the human immune system in that you have part of the genome is highly conserved and is not allowed to vary. And another part of the genome or the thing that's being made is allowed to vary in a bazillion random ways in order to find the solution to the problem fastest way. They all chemically signal each other and tell them to stop randomizing.
We lost you there. Go on.
He's back.
Somebody dropped off, I think.
Dave, are you back?
No, he just fell off. Lost to the jungle. Yeah. Well.
That was pretty good.
He's gone.
Really good.
It was very interesting. I actually have that paper in one of our archives. the one he was talking about, that they said the design, about how the hand works, and they retracted the paper. Because it had the design feature.
While we're waiting, I'd just like to make a conjecture. It seems to me that if there can be some sort of systematic method to quantify how hard is it to optimize an engineering system, that, you know, optimizing a given engineering system has to take a while, has to take a long time. Yeah, especially if it's being optimized by just some random process. And if we could boil down some, you know, take some simplest systems that exist in biology, like a PID or something, and then quantify how long does it take to tweak this up, to put it into an optimal state. Okay. And then just try to take an inventory of how many of these we got, you know, how long each one takes to optimize. My conjecture is it's going to take way longer than the history of the universe.
I think these things have been tackled.
Yeah.
And the term NP hard, which I've heard before, but I don't exactly know what it means, but they've done some quantitation around the NP hard optimization problems. And, you know, they can show just like there's X number, but only one of them would take the existing time to solve in space, and with all these positive assumptions. And so you just don't practically ever get there. And so, and then you just, well, now you're a god of the gaps. If you try to invoke a designer, then they'll say, well, you're a god of the gaps.
Okay, I'm back. Yeah, it's getting really unstable apparently.
That's all right. Well, thank you so much. Anyways, I mean, logging in from Brazil, we really appreciate your time and your from so far away. It is a fascinating subject. I just wish we could, you know, have some more time and a stable connection to continue interacting more.
Where in Brazil are you?
It's Natal. It's about 2 hours ahead, time zone wise.
And where is it?
Natal.
Okay.
Natal is the name of the city. All right. Well, Dr. Snoke, we'll let you go. Thank you so much.
Okay.
I
Great
appreciate
talking with
it. Hopefully we'll be able to have you around here in Indianapolis soon. If you come around, please let us know.
Okay. All right. Well, good talking
Yeah,
with you. I'll
thank
see you
you.
later.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.
Okay. Bye.
Okay.